The winter ballroom of Buckingham Palace shimmered like a world carved from frost and candlelight, its vaulted ceiling echoing with music that swelled beneath glittering chandeliers. Duchess Eleanor of Ashbourne entered with the quiet grace of a woman who knew how to survive in rooms that were never meant for her. She wore a gown of pale blue silk trimmed with modest embroidery, its simplicity a gentle defiance against the extravagance surrounding her. Her fingers clutched a small leather-bound book, half hidden against her skirts, as though the words within could shield her from the sharp stares of the court. Tonight, however, even literature's comfort could not soften the coldness of her husband's neglect. Across the ballroom, the Duke of Ashbourne stood tall beside Countess Valerie Moreau, the newest fascination of London society. The Frenchwoman's gown glittered with silver threads and brazen confidence, her laughter drifting through the hall like perfume designed to intoxicate. She rested her hand lightly on the Duke's arm, and he bent his head to hear her whisper, a gesture intimate enough that the watching crowd exchanged delighted, poisonous glances. For months, talk had swirled that the Duke's admiration for the Countess was more than diplomatic courtesy, yet never had the rumors felt so sharp, so shamelessly displayed, as in this moment beneath the palace's golden light. Eleanor paused near the entrance, her breath catching as her husband's gaze met hers across the room. For a fleeting second, she hoped he might cross to greet her, acknowledge her presence, or even offer the polite bow required by propriety. Instead, he turned back to the Countess, lips curving into a faint smile reserved for women he found captivating. A cluster of ladies near Eleanor lifted their fans just high enough to mask their murmurs, though not high enough to hide their pity. She forced her chin to remain level, her expression calm, even as her heart pressed painfully against her ribs. The orchestra shifted melodies, and couples drifted into a sweeping waltz. The Duke extended his hand to Valerie, who accepted with a triumphant tilt of her head. Together they glided onto the polished floor, moving with effortless elegance. Eleanor watched, her posture as composed as a statue, though her gloved fingers trembled around the book she held. She wondered, as she did far too often, whether she had ever truly captured her husband's interest or whether she had merely been an advantageous match selected for her lineage. She had entered the marriage with quiet hope, believing that affection might grow from shared duty. Instead, she had learned how invisible a duchess could become when her husband turned his attention elsewhere. A young viscount approached Eleanor with a stiff bow, offering polite greetings, but his eyes flickered nervously toward the dancing couple. His discomfort reminded her of the whispers she had already begun to sense. Even the servants seemed to know more of her husband's preferences than she did. The viscount excused himself quickly, leaving her once more alone beneath the glittering chandeliers. The music, though beautiful, pressed against her ears like a cruel reminder of the harmony she lacked in her own marriage. As the dance ended, the Duke escorted the Countess toward the refreshment table, his hand lingering just a moment too long on her back. His valet brought forth a small velvet case, which he opened discreetly. Inside gleamed a sapphire brooch fashioned in the shape of a blooming lily. Eleanor froze, recognizing the piece instantly. It had been commissioned months earlier, intended as a surprise gift for her upcoming birthday. She had overheard discussions between the jeweler and the Duke's steward. The brooch had been designed to match the blue of her eyes. Yet now it lay in the Duke's palm, and without hesitation he fastened it onto Valerie's gown while the room watched in delighted awe. A murmur rippled through the hall like wind stirring tall grass. The Countess lifted her chin, radiant in her triumph, while Eleanor felt something brittle crack quietly inside her. She kept her face composed, though she sensed the weight of every gaze assessing her reaction. She had been raised to understand dignity, to understand silence, but she had not known that humiliation could feel so sharp, so thoroughly public, and yet force her to remain perfectly still. She attempted to move toward a quieter corner, seeking refuge behind a marble column, but two ladies intercepted her path with sympathetic smiles too sweet to be sincere. Their voices hovered just loud enough to be heard. One whispered that the Duke had grown distant. The other speculated the marriage might soon dissolve. Eleanor pretended not to hear, but the words struck her with the precision of daggers disguised in lace. A footman approached to offer her wine, and she accepted with a nod, grateful for any excuse to keep her shaking hands occupied. As she sipped, she caught a group of diplomats exchanging glances before one leaned toward another and murmured, "It is a shame. A duchess abandoned in plain sight." She closed her eyes briefly, wishing she could disappear into the sea of jewels and silk around her, yet knowing she could not retreat without appearing weak. Moments later, she stumbled upon the harshest whisper of all. Two young debutantes stood near an arched doorway, oblivious to her presence. One said, "I heard the Duke may seek an annulment. They say he wants someone more suitable to his tastes." The other giggled behind her fan. Then the Duchess should prepare herself. Eleanor felt her breath falter, and for a moment the hall blurred. She steadied herself, lifting her chin as though bracing against a cold wind. To react would grant victory to every watching eye. To flee would confirm every rumor. She inhaled slowly, summoning what remained of her composure. The room continued its glittering dance around her, music swelling while laughter rang like glass. The Duke did not look her way. The Countess laughed too brightly, the sapphires on her gown catching the light like captured stars. Eleanor stood alone beneath the enormous chandeliers, the book still pressed against her palm, feeling as though the palace itself had swallowed her voice. Yet as she stood there, motionless and dignified, the faintest ember of resolve stirred within her. The humiliation weighed heavily, but something deeper whispered that this moment would not break her, even if it had cracked something that could never be mended. And as she lifted her gaze once more toward the distant figure of her husband, she understood that whatever came next would shape not only her marriage, but the very course of her life. Eleanor spent the morning after the disastrous ball hidden within her private library at Ashbourne House, surrounded by the scent of aging paper and dusted sunlight that filtered through tall windows. The world beyond the shelves felt unbearably loud, filled with whispers she could still hear echoing from the palace. In the quiet, she tried to steady her breath, though the humiliation clung to her like an unwelcome shadow. Her book lay unopened on her lap, its familiar comfort rendered useless beneath the weight of last night's memory. She kept recalling the sapphire brooch gleaming on Valerie's gown, and each recollection struck her with fresh pain. She reached for a sheet of parchment, intending to compose a letter to her husband. Her hand hesitated before she wrote a single line. "My lord, I hope you will forgive my absence for breakfast." The words looked small, almost fragile, as though even ink was too thin to carry the heaviness of her heart. She continued slowly, each sentence measured and precise, revealing neither bitterness nor accusation. There were things she longed to say. Why did you turn from me? Why did you choose her? But dignity held her back, urging restraint. When she finished, she read it once more, then folded it carefully, though she lacked the courage to send it. The city, however, refused her even a day's reprieve. By midday, a knock sounded at the library door. A footman entered with a foreign newspaper in hand, his expression stiff with discomfort. "Your Grace, this arrived from the embassy. His Grace is not at home." Eleanor nodded and dismissed him, then unfolded the paper. As her eyes skimmed the print, her stomach tightened. The headline smeared her name with elegant cruelty. "English Duchess offends French Countess at Royal Gathering." The article claimed Eleanor had openly slighted Valerie, suggesting jealousy and impropriety. It described her as cold, resentful, and unsuited to her role, words invented to entertain readers abroad, but perfectly designed to wound her. A tremor passed through her. She knew the article would arrive in London's hands within hours, igniting another wave of gossip. She set the paper aside, but its accusations lingered like smoke in a closed room. She thought of confronting her husband, yet the memory of his indifference silenced the impulse. Still, she hoped, naively, that he might return soon, ask if she was harmed by the slander, or offer even the smallest assurance. Instead, afternoon drifted into evening without him. The house felt hollow, as though the walls absorbed her disappointment and echoed it back softly. When the Duke finally returned, Eleanor remained in the shadows of the upper staircase, watching him remove his gloves with an air of practiced calm. He spoke briefly to his steward, asking whether any urgent messages awaited him. The steward hesitated before mentioning the newspaper, but the Duke only frowned faintly and replied, "Her Grace is resilient. Society's chatter seldom troubles her." The word struck Eleanor like a cold gust. She withdrew before he could see her, unwilling to reveal the depth of her hurt. His assumption that she felt nothing proved how little he understood her. The next morning, another blow arrived in the form of a package. Eleanor opened the velvet box and immediately recognized the sapphire brooch she had admired in sketches months earlier, the same design the Duke had gifted to Valerie. Yet this version seemed meant for her, and for a moment hope flickered. But an enclosed note, unsigned yet unmistakably feminine, crushed that spark. "This was the brooch intended for you." He changed his mind. Eleanor closed the lid slowly, each movement deliberate, as though the careful restraint could keep her heart from shattering. She placed the box atop her writing desk, unable to bear its presence, yet unwilling to hide it away. By afternoon, she made a decision. She informed the household she would leave for her family's estate under the pretext of visiting her mother, whose health had recently waned. Though the reason was plausible, everyone understood the truth. Her quiet departure became a story before she stepped into the carriage. Servants lowered their gazes respectfully, yet sympathy dimmed their expressions. Eleanor wondered when her life had become a performance of composure, observed and dissected by everyone except the one person whose opinion mattered most. The journey to the countryside offered no comfort. The winter landscape stretched in muted colors, fields washed pale beneath a gray sky. Eleanor pressed her hand to the carriage window, tracing the condensation absently. She tried to sort her thoughts, but they tangled around each other like threads pulled too tightly. She loved her husband. She admitted this painfully, but she no longer knew whether that love was a strength or a burden. Silence filled the carriage, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of wheels over frozen ground. At the estate, familiar hallways welcomed her with a gentle warmth she had not felt in months. Her mother embraced her tenderly, though Eleanor avoided revealing the true reason for her visit. She spent the evening walking the gardens despite the cold, needing space to breathe. She imagined what society was already saying, how the countess might be reveling in her absence, how the Duke might not even notice she had gone. These thoughts pressed on her until she felt nearly breathless. Back in London, the Duke entered his study later that night to search for a misplaced document. While rummaging through the drawers of Eleanor's writing desk, a desk she seldom used in his presence, he found a bundle of sealed letters tied neatly with ribbon. Curious, he untied them and unfolded the first. His breath caught as he read words meant for him, written in Eleanor's elegant hand. She had poured her heart onto those pages, her hope that their marriage might deepen, her admiration for his strength, her sorrow over his growing distance, her attempts to understand why she was not enough. One letter confessed, "I wish I knew how to reach you. I stand beside you, and yet I am miles away. Still, I would choose you in every lifetime." The Duke read the words twice, then a third time, feeling something inside him twist sharply. He had not imagined she felt so deeply. He had assumed her silence meant indifference, not love. Another letter described her fear of failing him as a duchess, of disappointing a man she respected more than he realized. The Duke's hands trembled as he set the papers down, his chest tightening until he could scarcely breathe. For the first time, the magnitude of his neglect struck him with full force. He had humiliated a woman who loved him without asking for anything in return. He closed his eyes, gripping the edge of the desk, overwhelmed by the realization that he had driven her away. And as he stood there, surrounded by the soft glow of candlelight, he understood that the quiet wife he had overlooked might be the only person who had ever given him genuine devotion. The Duke remained standing in the dim study long after the candles had burned low, his fingers still resting on the letters that had altered the entire shape of his understanding. Eleanor's handwriting seemed to pulse with quiet sincerity, every line revealing devotion he had never acknowledged. Shame gathered within him like a tightening storm, heavy and relentless. He tried to recall the last time he had spoken to her with genuine regard, the last time he had looked at her without impatience. Yet the memories evaded him like fragments of a forgotten dream. Instead, scenes of her silent endurance crowded his thoughts, each one sharper now that he recognized the truth concealed beneath her composure. As he paced, fragments of conversations returned unbidden. He remembered her hesitant smile at their wedding breakfast, the soft way she had squeezed his hand during their first public appearance, and the quiet attempts she had made to join his interests. He recalled dismissing her opinions with careless ease and leaving her alone during countless evenings. He had convinced himself she preferred solitude, but these letters proved her solitude had been forced, not chosen. The realization hollowed him. He had mistaken her dignity for indifference, her silence for contentment, and her gentle loyalty for lack of passion. Now every misinterpretation felt like an unforgivable error. A knock at the door startled him. His steward entered hesitantly, carrying a sealed note delivered from the French embassy. The Duke dismissed him quickly, then broke the wax. The message exposed an unsettling truth. Countess Valerie had been spreading the very rumors that destroyed Eleanor's reputation, using her influence to manipulate diplomatic circles for her own gain. The note mentioned overheard conversations in which Valerie boasted about turning London's court in her favor and hinted at exploiting the Duke's name to secure foreign alliances. His jaw tightened as he read, fury rising alongside regret. For months he had been blind to her ambition, mistaking cunning for charm. He left the study at once and made his way to Valerie's guest residence. She greeted him with a practiced smile, draped in silk and self-assurance. The Duke wasted no time. He confronted her with the letter, demanding explanations. Valerie laughed softly, as though amused by his outrage. "My lord," she said coolly, "you were useful for a time. Surely you did not imagine I sought affection in this frozen country." Her words sliced through the remains of his pride. He realized, with cold clarity, that he had sacrificed his wife's dignity for a woman who never valued him. As he turned to leave, Valerie called after him, "Your Duchess was always too meek for the world you inhabit." He paused only long enough to reply, "She possesses a strength you could never fathom." Returning home, he did not rest. Winter rain lashed against the windows, thunder rolling across the distant hills. Eleanor was miles away at her family's estate, yet her absence felt immediate, echoing through the halls like a reprimand. The Duke stepped into his chamber and stared at the empty space where she once prepared for evening events, realizing he had never wondered how lonely she felt dressing alone. Every object in the room whispered reminders of what he had taken for granted. He could not bear it. Driven by something urgent and unfamiliar, he summoned his horse despite the storm. The stable master protested, warning that the roads were dangerous, but the Duke mounted without hesitation. Rain soaked through his cloak as he urged the horse into the darkness, wind whipping around him like the very consequences of his pride. Each mile he traveled intensified his determination. He could no longer allow distance to serve as a barrier between them. If Eleanor still held space in her heart for him, he needed to earn it. If she did not, he would at least offer an apology unsullied by expectation. The countryside blurred beneath the relentless storm. Branches bent under pounding rain, and the road churned into mud that splashed against the horse's hooves. Yet he pressed forward. His mind replayed Eleanor's letters, each one a testament to a love he had never appreciated. He recalled her gentle voice asking whether he would join her for supper, and his dismissive refusal. He remembered her waiting for him on the balcony during summer evenings, hoping he might share a moment of peace. She had been offering him a life of quiet devotion, while he had been foolishly chasing admiration that meant nothing. Hours later, the lights of the estate appeared through sheets of falling rain. The Duke dismounted, scarcely aware of his trembling limbs. He pushed open the heavy door without waiting for a servant and stepped into the warm glow of the entrance hall. His heart beat unevenly as he searched for her. A maid startled at his sudden appearance and whispered that the Duchess was in the library. He followed the familiar corridor, gripping the letters in his hand as though they anchored him to purpose. Eleanor stood near the hearth, the fire casting soft light over her features. She looked startled when he entered, then wary, as though bracing for further hurt. For a moment neither spoke. Rain dripped from his cloak onto the polished floor, yet he remained frozen, struck by the quiet beauty of her presence. He saw not the distant Duchess he had ignored, but the woman who had once believed in him. Her eyes held questions, fear, and something gentler that flickered uncertainly. He stepped forward, voice trembling despite his attempt at composure. He told her he had read her letters. He told her he had been blind, selfish, and careless with her heart. Eleanor listened silently, her expression unreadable. The storm outside roared, yet inside the room every sound seemed muted beneath the weight of his confession. He admitted he had misunderstood her silence, assuming she needed nothing from him. He confessed he had wanted admiration, but had discovered, far too late, that admiration was hollow compared to her quiet loyalty. Eleanor swallowed, her gaze dropping momentarily before lifting again with measured restraint. She asked why he had come. The Duke answered simply, "Because the thought of a life without you makes breathing impossible." The truth hung between them, fragile yet potent. Eleanor's eyes softened, though uncertainty still clouded them. She whispered that wounds inflicted so deeply could not vanish with words alone. Her honesty struck him harder than any accusation. The fire crackled softly as they stood facing one another, two lives bound by vows yet fractured by choices. The Duke's voice broke as he added, "I do not ask for forgiveness tonight. I ask only for the chance to prove I can be the man you once hoped I might become." Eleanor's breath hitched, her composure wavering, torn between desire and caution. Her silence stretched long enough to fill the room with aching suspense. And just as she parted her lips to speak, the storm thundered overhead, leaving her answer suspended in the charged air. The rain eased to a mist by the time Edward and Eleanor reached the steps of Ashbourne Court, and the servants who had anxiously lingered in the entrance hall retreated with a tactful bow when they saw the Duchess leaning against her husband with an exhaustion that went deeper than fatigue. Edward guided her inside with a gentleness that startled even him, for it felt as though the fragile weight of her trust rested entirely in his hands. He knew he had wounded her too thoroughly to expect easy forgiveness. Yet the simple fact that she allowed him to support her gave him a sliver of hope he dared not squander. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender oil and polished oak, and as he helped her remove her damp cloak, he could not escape the memory of how many evenings she had walked these same corridors alone while he squandered his attention on a woman who cared only for the glitter of court approval. Eleanor's eyes lifted momentarily, searching his face as though trying to decide if the man before her was truly the same husband who had once dismissed her with a single cool glance. He held her gaze without flinching, letting her see the remorse that had settled in him like stone. They moved to the small parlor near the west gallery, a room Eleanor favored for its quiet fireplace and soft chairs, though she had long ceased inviting him to join her. Edward lit the fire himself, unwilling to summon a servant, feeling somehow that such gestures were the barest beginning of what he owed her. Eleanor sat near the hearth, warming her hands, and though her posture was straight, her expression betrayed a sorrow that had not yet softened. He stood a few steps away, uncertain whether to approach or give her distance, and the silence stretched until she finally spoke, her voice low, almost fragile. She thanked him for bringing her home, for waiting for her, for the difficult ride through the storm. Yet every word carried the underlying question neither of them dared to voice. What now? He answered quietly that he had come not merely to escort her back, but to stand beside her however she chose, whether that meant rebuilding their marriage or allowing him to prove through actions rather than apologies that he had learned the price of neglect. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned them toward the firelight, revealing a vulnerability she rarely displayed. She confessed that she no longer understood the shape of her own feelings. For so long she had tried to be dutiful, dignified, graceful under scrutiny, believing that eventually he might look her way not out of obligation, but out of genuine affection. Yet when he humiliated her with his pursuit of the countess, the humiliation felt sharper because it crushed the small hope she had guarded in silence. Edward knelt before her, not as a gesture of dramatics, but as an instinctive acknowledgement that his pride no longer had a place between them. He told her of the emptiness he had felt each time he returned to her absence, the hollowness that had spread through him when he learned the countess had manipulated him for political advantage, and the anguish he experienced reading Eleanor's letters to her mother, letters he should never have seen, but which revealed a steadfastness he never deserved. Her eyes flickered with shock at his admission, and he explained how they had fallen from her luggage when he had packed her belongings to bring her home. Eleanor listened without reprimand, yet the pain in her expression deepened, as though hearing her private sorrow in his voice made the old wounds throb anew. They remained like that for a long moment, the fire crackling softly, the storm fading beyond the windows. Edward continued, telling her that he did not expect her to trust him swiftly, that he knew trust rebuilt slowly, like mending a cracked porcelain vase, patient, delicate, requiring care from both sides. He told her he had requested a formal withdrawal from certain court obligations and declined future invitations he once chased so eagerly, choosing instead to dedicate himself to estate matters and to strengthening the quiet world they shared. Eleanor looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and longing, and he felt the shift in the room like a held breath finally released. She asked whether he meant to isolate himself out of guilt or because he had finally realized that a marriage could not thrive when one partner sought admiration elsewhere. He admitted he had finally understood that admiration from strangers meant nothing when compared to the quiet honor of being truly known by the one person whose opinion mattered. Eleanor lowered her gaze, absorbing his words, and her voice softened as she said she had once dreamed of a marriage where both partners found comfort in each other's presence, where disagreements were not punishments but chances to understand more deeply. She confessed she had doubted such harmony was possible with him, and even now, part of her feared that these tender promises were simply contrition dressed as devotion. Edward's breath caught, for he knew she was right to question him. He promised that his transformation was not a moment of guilt, but the product of weeks spent confronting the consequences of his selfishness. He swore he would prove it through constancy, through small, patient acts rather than urgent declarations. She studied him, her expression unreadable, and finally said she wanted time. Time to breathe, time to heal, time to believe that love, once cracked, could be reshaped. He accepted this with a quiet nod, though a faint ache threaded through his chest. She asked him to stay nearby, not in her room, but within reach, for she did not wish to confuse forgiveness with immediate closeness. He agreed, grateful for even that fragile thread of connection. He rose slowly, but before he could step away, she reached out and touched his hand, lightly, uncertainly, but enough to stop his breath. She whispered that she had missed the version of him who spoke softly, who listened, who saw her not as a political arrangement, but as a woman capable of deep loyalty and deeper love. Her touch lingered, hesitant yet purposeful, and he closed his fingers gently around hers, as though anchoring both of them to a moment that felt too delicate to disturb. The fire cast a warm glow across her features, softening the shadows beneath her eyes. Edward lifted her hand slowly, brushing a reverent kiss against her knuckles, not demanding anything, not assuming a future, but offering a silent vow. Eleanor did not withdraw. Instead, she exhaled, a trembling sound that felt like the first hint of forgiveness. And though they were still standing on uncertain ground, something shifted between them, something quiet, cautious, yet undeniably alive. When he stepped back, she watched him with an expression less guarded than before, and he felt hope settle into him, not as a flash of triumph, but as a humble, steady promise that with patience, gentleness, and truth, they might yet build something stronger than what had been wounded.